Cheers, guys. Epix911, welcome to the Elitist Geek on a Saturday, and that's a freaking good thing. I love my Saturdays. It's also a Saturday in which I slept in way longer than usual. I'm usually up because of work being such an early thing. My body clock is conditioned to wake up early, like 7, 8 o'clock. I slept in till 2 p.m. And part of the reason for that is I did just extensive field testing of the Oculus Rift. 13 hours of straight use, and within that time frame and subsequent, because I still haven't tried the Vive, I just wanted an undiluted opinion of the Rift, right? I'm going to be living with both of these devices. As I've told you guys before, I got no time for fanboyism personally. Been there, done that. I'm too old for that crap. It's about the games. These are vehicles through which to enjoy the games, however, so it is worth talking about pros and cons, but it isn't even a rating system. I came up with an equal number for each. It's just one person's subjective opinion, mine, right? Your mileage may vary, fair enough, but if any of these opinions answer some of your questions, I can only see that as being a good thing, right? But even then, get a second opinion, a third opinion. Don't make my opinion gospel, right? Because it's subjective. It's my preference. So, HTC Vive. Let's start there because it's the device, let's face it, you guys know I've used the most, right? So, when we're talking about pros, one of the first pros would be Room VR, right? But it's not enough to just say Room VR because you're quickly going to get the diehards that only support the Rift at the cost of everything else saying, our Rift can do Room VR. Just like I pointed out in the video, it's perfectly capable of functioning in a Room VR environment. True. It can do that. What it can't do is offer you the full, thought out, bundled, ready at launch system that the Vive has via its Chaperone system. Its front-mounted camera, and again, fanboys will be quick to defend the Rift and say, it doesn't need a camera because it's a seated experience, whereas with the Vive, it's to ensure that dorks don't bash their head against a wall. Fair enough, right? You could look at it that way. I don't. I look at it as offering Room VR, which to me is a separate enough experience from seated that it should almost kind of be, kind of judged in its own right, because it is that different. It takes you away from a VR experience that is strictly seated for the most part, right? And puts you in a scenario where you can walk around a room in a game, in a genre that has yet to be developed. That's how different it is, right? So definitely a pro in terms of how they've thought out the solution. So when I say Room VR, got to take into account the Chaperone system. You can play 2-3 hours straight on a Vive. You can too on a Rift. But during that time, you can drink, you can eat, and I've done all of that with the HTC Vive Predator Vision. Thanks to a tip from one of you, I just drank my beer through a straw. Works perfect. Brilliant. No complaints. Horizontal field of view. Definitely, in my opinion, another pro on the Vive's part. The Vive just creates a sense. It's not massively better, but it's noticeable to me in the horizontal, right? The horizontal field of view just seems that much more immersive to me on the HTC Vive. The Vive controllers, completely acknowledge that the Rift is getting its controllers. I personally can't wait because I think that's really going to open up the Rift. But right now you're stuck with a gamepad, albeit a pretty decent one, an Xbox One controller, which I kind of like. This was the first time I basically used one because I pretty much use 360 controllers for my PC stuff. So the Vive controller is definitely another pro. It's also a device that's easier to configure for a vacuum fit on your face. That comes with its own negative, which we'll talk about. But I definitely feel that you can get a snugger, tighter fit with the Vive than you can with the Rift. The Rift you can get snug, but it's very rail-based, the adjustments, right? It's not as fine-tuned as, You could have, those minute differences based on different straps because you're dealing with a rail, kind of horizontal rail system on the Rift. So definitely easier to configure for a vacuum fit. Again, that comes with a negative, which we'll talk about. And then the ability to drink and eat without removal of the HMD, I think, is definitely another pro for the Vive, as I pointed out with the Room VR and Chaperone system. And that has to stand alone as a pro, because nothing is more immersive busting next to a dead pixel than having to take your HMD off to do something. Bodily functions, food, etc. The cons for the Vive. Well, if we're talking Vive cons, you definitely, if you're doing your due diligence, you'd have to mention the cable weight and volume of cables, because most of us Vive users would agree that the cables are heavy, they're clunky. Yes, you learn to sidestep them, but that still breaks immersion to some degree, right? And just the volume of cables. Like, you've got basically a thick 3-in-1 cable. It's really heavy. And if you then connect headphones or earbuds, you've got kind of a dangling piece that you don't have with the Rift, right? So definitely a con. Another con would be it's a bulkier and heavier head-mounted display. No comparison. And yes, it's a subjective opinion, but it's also a factual one. If you weigh the two, the Vive's Rift is, or the Vive's HMD is much heavier. And of course, some of that has to do with one of its pros, the Chaperone system, right? That front-mounted camera, etc. All the sensors that are built in, because its tracking system is essentially the inverse of Rift's. So you'll find that with a lot of these, even when I talk about the Rift, some of the pros have associated cons and vice versa, right? And then the last con to talk about for the HTC Vive would be the depth of field. And nowhere did I notice this more, guys, than when I put the HMD on for Elite Dangerous. It was immediately noticeable. And here's how I can kind of describe that. So in HTC Vive, now that we have that awesome multiplier setting, visually, honestly, it's on par now with the Rift. I made sure of it, and I played enough Elite Dangerous. I think if you guys, even though that's my subjective opinion, I think most of you are going to put some validity weight to that statement, because I played me a lot of Elite Dangerous on the Vive. The star field in Elite Dangerous on the Vive has always felt kind of like this artificial construct, right? Kind of like a painting. It didn't feel like space was light years in the distance. It felt like space was somewhere the border of which I could actually fly to. And I could still play and enjoy the game without that, right? But on the Rift, definitely, it felt like space, right? So let's talk about the Rift. Let's look at the pros for the Rift that I experienced. So the first one would be minimal cable weight and volume. That's just a no-brainer. I mean, it's got literally the one cable. That's it. It's super light. And, if you're doing more of a stand-up experience, and you're doing even if it's smaller, right, with the one tracking station, say you're doing 5 by 6 feet or whatever, you're still taking into account that cable, but my God, it's so much lighter. You notice that immediately. It's also the next pro, it's nowhere near as heat generating, the Rift, partly because of that weight. So when I talk about cable volume weight, I'm also talking about the HMD in the same statement. It's a much lighter head-mounted display. And literally, like I said, 13 hours of playing, none of the sweat issues with 2 guys in the room. You guys saw my buddy in the background if you watched the last video. Some funny comments on that, by the way, because of his stare when I was doing the unboxing there. But, granted, I had AC running like I usually do, but I didn't generate near the heat or the sweat. So that whole replaceable, you know, eye fit on the Vive doesn't seem to even be an issue with the Rift based on my initial experience, right? Easier to configure. Oh my God. Other than the USB issue, right, which was a driver issue, setup is just night and day. The Vive, you know, I'm a techie, so it wasn't a huge thing, right? I'd still rather set up the Vive than your standard IKEA piece of furniture any day. Definitely easier to do than that, but the Rift, far superior in terms of ease of setup. But like I said, every pro comes with a con. The con there is obviously lack of Chaperone, room VR, etc., right? But if you're looking at it strictly on a configure to configure basis, Rift has it, hands down. The next thing as a pro, and I'm not going to penalize the Vive for this, so it wasn't really a con because I'd kind of gotten used to it. And anybody who just owns a Vive, that probably be the case. But the Rift, much less noticeable screen door effect. And screen door is basically just your ability to see the pixels, right? So that dead pixel that I see on the replacement Vive, the square that makes up that pixel is much more noticeable than the pixel on the counterpart, the Rift. To the point where, even though it would still be distracting to have a dead pixel on the Rift, which I didn't have, by the way, perfect screen so far, nothing near center, I don't think you'd notice it near as much, right? So minimal screen door effect compared to the Vive. Depth of field, definitely a pro. Again, Elite Dangerous, it felt like I was in space. The depth, and that even comes through when if you look back at my Elite Dangerous Vive video, right? I talk about the immersion, but I always talk about the immersion in relation to what's around you, right? When I talk about feeling the pressing weight of the space station or the planet looming in front of you, not so much the vacuum of space. And that's because of that feeling. Not so on the Rift. It feels infinitely deep, like the universe and galaxy should when you're looking up at space. Cons. Obviously, the no room VR and accompanying Chaperone system. So again, yes, you could argue that you could do room VR, but it's not near as thought out. It's not bundled and integrated as fully and complete as the Vive's Chaperone system and camera is with it. Which kind of makes sense because initially, at least right now, the Rift is more geared towards a seated experience. Not exclusive, just more geared that way. And those items just weren't necessary. Gamepad as the initial control device. Do I have that here? Yes, I do. So definitely a con. In as much for me, again, subjectively, when I play a game like Elite Dangerous, right? I wouldn't use a Vive controller or even the Oculus controller when it's available. I'm going to use whatever's best for the game because, again, it's about the game. So I would use a HOTAS, right? But for those games where you're substituting your hands in a VR environment, right? Something like Audio Shield or Space Pirate, they would be nowhere near as immersive with this, right? So thankfully, the Rift controllers are coming, already on the waiting list. I want. So definitely a con. Gamepad is the initial. And the last con for me was, even though it's lighter and just feels awesome, it's cool, it doesn't generate near as much heat, it's not as face positionally adjustable. Again, because of this kind of rail system that it uses, you're not able to get that same 360 degree positional fit that you get with a Vive. It was perfectly comfortable when it was on. You just can't tweak it to the same degree, right? So there you have it, guys. It's like I said in the other video, it's not as bad because, yes, I'll be without my room VR, which will suck, but at least I have a Rift to wait until I get the Vive. And yeah, next up we've got a news video and Vanishing Realms and Solus Project for Vive. So I'll get those out later. As always, guys, Cheers. Oh, and curious to hear what you guys think, for anybody who owns both, or even if you've tried both. You don't have to necessarily own the other unit, but hopefully you've given it more than 5 minutes, right? Love to hear your opinion.